All right. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Now, apologies, as the original programmed event featuring Summer Ahmed will have to be postponed as she called last minute, and there was a personal scheduling conflict with her. So, rather, for this week's podcast, we are pleased to be joined by my colleague Dexter Van Zile, who is the managing editor of the Middle East Forum's Focus on Western Islamism publication. And Dexter just recently returned from a 5-day trip to Dearborn, Michigan, during a very critical time in that city. And Dexter has agreed to step in last minute to speak about what he saw and what he experienced during his trip. And as always, at the later half of the session, we invite your audience questions, which you can ask by using the Q&A box or the chat window inside of Riverside. And with that, I will turn the floor to Dexter Van Zile, who can tell us about his trip.
Thank you very much, Enough. It's very good to be here. Last Monday, I flew into Dearborn, Michigan. The day before a city council meeting took place in Dearborn, Dearborn City Council meeting, where there was essentially a confrontation between Mayor Abdullah Hammoud and some of his critics who were angry about the way he had treated a resident of the city by the name of Ted Barham. On September 9th, Ted Barham went to the city council and criticized the city council for allowing a street sign to be put in honor of an individual by the name of Osama Siblani. Now, during the course of the meeting on September 9th, it was revealed that actually this was not a city decision. It was a decision that was made by Wayne County. It was on a county section of the road. But the mayor of Dearborn, Abdullah Hammoud, instead of actually saying, hey, look, this is in the county, we didn't have any control over it, what he did was he condemned Ted Barham as an Islamophobe. The reason why Ted Barham was unhappy about the intersection being named after Osama Siblani is that Osama Siblani, who's the editor of Arab American News, has over the years actually run interference for Hezbollah and Hamas. He will talk about those organizations as being legitimate resistance organizations and not genocidal organizations that want to destroy the state of Israel and suppress sovereign Jewish life in the Middle East. And Ted Barham was very explicit. He used very specific information in challenging the mayor. And at one point, he read the information and some of the things that Osama Siblani had said over the years. I have done some digging in the course into Osama Siblani's newspaper and his statements over the years. In the early 1990s, one of the things he did was he condemned Bill Clinton for meeting with Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, saying that by meeting with Rushdie, one of the things he had done was essentially insulted Islam, even though what Bill Clinton was doing was defending the right to free speech for Salman Rushdie, which is a good thing for an American president to do. And the interesting thing is that he said this insults Islam. Well, he's a newspaper publisher, and you would think that as a newspaper publisher, he would be an indefatigable defender of the First Amendment because it's part of his working capital. And as a newspaper reporter from back in the day, that's a very important thing. A lot of people say things that I find insults to my identity, and I say, well, but that's free speech. And one of the things that you'll find if you look closely at the Arab American News is that ultimately he is very critical of Sunni extremist groups. He's been critical of Al-Qaeda, and he's also been critical of ISIS. But when it comes to Iranian organizations or Shia organizations, he's a little bit less critical. And I think one of the reasons why is because he himself is a Shia Muslim from Lebanon. And so this is a very interesting thing. When you look at the interviews that he's done, he gets credit for attacking or condemning Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and the attacks on 9/11. But if you look closely, he takes a much softer tone with the violence perpetrated by Hezbollah and the Iranian proxy Hamas. And I know that Hamas is a Sunni organization largely, but over the past few years, it's basically been working for Iran. and it's pretty well understood that it perpetrated the October 7th massacre largely to disrupt the Abraham Accords. And one of the things is that at the city council meeting that took place on September 23rd, so there was a showdown, or basically the mayor attacked a resident of Dearborn. 2 weeks later, you knew that there was going to be a showdown. And I want to make it clear, I had actually organized the trip to Dearborn before any of this had happened, so it was providential. One of the interesting things is that the people who criticized the Mayor Hammoud for the things that he said some of them were evangelical Protestant ministers who had operated in Muslim-majority environments and knew about the problems that non-Muslims had in Muslim-majority environments. And so when they saw this harassment and this abuse directed at Ted Barham, they understood that this was in a global context. But there was another group of people that came to the mayor's defense. And those people, and you can watch the video, you can find the link to the video of the September 23rd meeting in the article published on Middle East Forum's website. The interesting thing is that the people who relied on, who needed to maintain access and good relations with City Hall, they came to Mayor Hammoud's defense. There was a dividing line. If you knew about the oppression that non-Muslims endured in Muslim-majority environments, you were critical of what Mayor Hammoud had done. But if you relied on the city for public goods, access to or power and prestige, well, then you defended the mayor, and you can watch the video for yourself. Now, interestingly enough, it's much more difficult to find the video of the original confrontation that took place on September 9th. But you can find it on the article that we published at Focus on Western Islamism. You can go to meforum.org/FWY. You can find all the video yourself. So we published the article on Wednesday. On the following day, I went to a mosque. And I went to a number of mosques, knocked on the doors, pretty much a repeat of the work that I did with the Middle East Forum support in London, Birmingham, and Manchester in December. The goal was to essentially interact with as many imams that would talk to me. I knocked on the door of the Islamic Center of America. They didn't call me back. I gave them my business card. I was always direct, saying, this is who I am, this is who I work for, and this is where you can find the stuff that I write. Imam Husseini at the Karbala Mosque, which is a Shia mosque in Dearborn, was very kind and spoke to me. And I spoke to one of his congregants, or one of his followers, for about maybe 20 minutes to a half hour. And I said, so how many people come to this mosque? And he said, well, about 400 to 500 people attend worship services at this mosque on a regular basis. And so I asked him, so how many people support Hezbollah? And he said 90%. 90% of the people at that mosque support Hezbollah, which is an organization that has murdered U.S. citizens. Okay? And these people are all, but most of the people, they're either immigrants or citizens of the United States. And when Hassan Nasrallah was killed last year, they had a large, event protesting his death. And I asked people, I asked this person who was at the mosque, I said, so President Raisi, did people respond to that? And he said, oh yes, people were very sad. So these are people who are ultimately more supportive of, they're supportive of Iran and Shia aggression against Israel. And this was a very profound issue for me. Okay. I'm a native born American, and so when I spoke to the Imam Husseini, who at one point was supposed to attend the inauguration and give the opening prayers for President Donald Trump, his name was taken off the program a few days or right before the inauguration. And I spoke to him about that, and he basically gave a contradictory answer. On one hand, he said that people from the LGBTQ community and the pro-Israel and the Jewish community went after him. And then another thing is that he said, but ultimately it was my decision, the imam's decision, to not attend and participate in the inauguration because he didn't want to create any controversy. Now, dealing with this Imam Husseini, he's a very affable individual, and you can understand why Donald Trump invited him to participate in the inauguration, because he's a very affable individual. But when I asked him about Hezbollah, he kind of evaded the question. I said, look, I spoke to one of your, congregants earlier today, and he said that 90% of the people at this mosque support Hezbollah. What do you think about Hezbollah? And what he did was he retreated into what I would call, theological talk. And he basically said, well, what does Hezbollah mean? Well, Hezbollah means party of God, and everybody can basically claim to be part of the party of God. And he did not actually address the issue on a policy level. And one of the things, and I'll be writing this up later, during the course of our conversation, when I asked him specifically about issues related to like support for Hezbollah, the practice of slavery in the West, I raised issues. Daniel Hakakachi, who's another Islamist, I said, is the issue of slavery in Islam in general, is this tolerable? Is this what people support? Can a man have more than one wife? And sometimes he would address the jurisprudence of it, but more often than not, when he would try to do was to retreat into the realm of theology. And one of the things that I have learned over the years during my time at the Middle East Forum is that Islam is a religion that's largely based on jurisprudence and not on theology. So I think this is really one of the questions that I have, or I have two questions after these interactions with people, and I'll just need to talk for a couple more minutes, is that the American people, we fought a war over the issue of racial supremacism, and we lost hundreds of thousands of people. And we had people like William Lloyd Garrison say that slavery was wrong. And so my question to an awful lot of the people who are Muslims who say, look, we worship a compassionate, loving, and merciful God. My question is, where is your William Lloyd Garrison? Where are you going to condemn the practice of religious supremacism? That's the issue. The United States historically and Dearborn itself has dealt with an issue of racial supremacism. But Islam deals with an issue of religious supremacism that has yet to be countered effectively. The third part of my trip, I went to the Arab American Discrimination Committee, and I saw a lot of information there. And ultimately, and people can ask me about it, I have come to the sad conclusion that hostility towards Israel and ultimately towards the United States and the West in general is a significant component of the identity that's put forth by the ADC. So there it is, enough. Sorry to go on so long. Good thing you jumped in to cut me off.
So you describe Mayor Hammoud's behavior as basically subordinating non-Muslims under the guise of coexistence. Can you elaborate a little more on what you mean by that?
Right. Okay. First of all, one of the historical points that I bet you a lot of people on this call understand is that there's a history of Dhimmitude. Whenever Islam becomes the dominant force in a society or civilization, non-Muslims essentially have to acquiesce to, and this is too good a word for it, but second-class citizenship. And the people who confronted him knew about this history. They knew about this history, and they said, are you going to condemn Hamas and Hezbollah? And he came out and accused them of Islamophobia, which is essentially the secular form of a blasphemy law. If you accuse non-Muslims in a Western democracy of being Islamophobes, basically what you have done is you have enforced a rule from Sharia law just using the language of secular ideology. That's what they're doing, secular ideology and law. And they're trying to figure out a way to make you to essentially submit and not criticize Islam. Historically, under the institution of Dhimmitude, which was derived from the word dhimma, which is a treaty of protection, and Mark Dury calls it a treaty of liability. Essentially, you're forced to pay a jizya tax in order to essentially have the right to practice your own non-Islamic faith. And one of the reasons why people like the Muslim community rulers like that was because it was a great source of income. Now, the thing is that I don't want to say that it's a one-to-one derivation or one-to-one application of Dhimmitude in Western democracies, but the attitude of supremacism and dominance was clearly evident here. Ted Barham, if you read the article, I described him essentially as an uppity non-Muslim who essentially did not know his place in the Islamic nomos, so to speak. And what the mayor did was shout at him, call him an Islamophobe, but that's the language of Western liberalism to basically stifle criticism of Islam, Muslims, and Islamism. And if there is to be assimilation with America's Arab population, and after my time in Dearborn, I'm very worried about that issue, particularly as what I saw at the ADC. We have to force people to reinterpret their scriptures and to reinterpret their faith and transform how their faith is practiced, just the same way that Christians reinterpreted and reworked their faith and transformed how they understood their scriptures in the aftermath of the Holocaust. There has been so much violence, so much misery in the Middle East, largely as a consequence of hostility towards non-Muslims and other Muslims that don't adhere to the exact line that one group adheres over another. That you would think that at a certain point, just after Christians reworked their faith after the Holocaust, that Muslim leaders and Muslim theologians and Muslim experts in jurisprudence would say, look, we have to rework it. The World Council of Churches, 1948, condemned anti-Semitism in response to the Holocaust. In 1965, the Roman Catholic Church, they issued the Nostra Aetate and said, we're going to suppress the deicide charge and quit talking ugly about the Jewish people the way we have been. In the 1930s, evangelical Protestants started the organization National Council for Christians and Jews because they were embarrassed about the anti-Black racism embraced and promoted by their fellow evangelicals. Okay. Now, we do see some signs of that in the Muslim world, but it's not anything like what needs to happen. If there is going to be peace between the various faith communities in the United States, Muslims are going to have to do some serious work to essentially transform how they practice their faith. And I don't think that that's, from what I saw in Dearborn, that's not high on the list of people's priorities.
All right, thank you. Now, one of the things you've noted is how Osama Siblani has at times called for basically limiting speech that he sees as being offensive to Islam. Do you see echoes here of the blasphemy laws and norms prevalent in the Middle East kind of being imported into American civic life?
Yeah, I think, and this is the interesting thing. It's the leftists who are helping them. And how are they helping them? One of the things that I've pretty much come to the conclusion is that the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee is essentially a leftist tool to promote Islamist rules about how to interact with Muslims in the West or in the United States. And clearly that's really what's going on. And one of the interesting things is that I took a close look at the Arab American news. And it's published in English and it's published in Arabic. And one of the cartoons that I found in Arabic condemned or made fun of the Syrian president, the current president of Syria, Jolani or al-Shara, for essentially willing to be able to talk to Israel over some sort of peace deal or some sort of ceasefire. And I ran it through Google Translate. And it was very critical of him. Okay. But it didn't show up in the English version of the newspaper. And so one of the things that I sent him an email, I said, look, people are always criticizing you, Arab leaders for saying one thing in English and another thing in Arabic. well, you didn't say this thing at all in English, but you did say it in Arabic. So what's going on here? And I think that this is really, I think what he's doing is that he's essentially using the principles of free speech and the freedom that's afforded to him in Western democracy to ultimately promote an ideology and ideas that would undermine the ability of non-Muslims to exercise those very rights. And this is something that I've been harping on for years and years and years, but it is particularly evident in Dearborn. And one of the things, and I want to repeat this issue, the people who confronted the Dearborn City Council were all people who had some understanding, some much deeper than others, that what Mayor Hammoud had done, he was in a secular manner, he was replicating what had happened on a religious manner in the Middle East and in Muslim majority countries. And it was very, very interesting. And once they understood that, these are people who wanted to evangelize to Muslims that didn't want to offend their sensibilities. That's what these people wanted to do. But they felt honor bound to point out what Mayor Hammoud had done.
Thank you. Now, what lessons should policymakers in Washington take from what's unfolding in Dearborn? And does this have implications for counterterrorism at both the local and national level?
It has real implications. And I am not a national security guy. I'm basically a guy that writes about culture and religion and Dhimmitude and in the West, that type of thing. But when you have 90% of a congregation that supports Hezbollah, some of those people are going to actually be willing to do something specific in support of Hezbollah. And the people that I spoke to, they are nervous. They are worried about their physical safety for speaking up. And I don't want to exaggerate their fear because they're pretty courageous, and I don't want to, but I think there's a concern. And I think there's a huge issue, and I hope that, just recently, the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against American Muslims for Palestine and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. That lawsuit just got filed today, and we'll be doing an article about it. It'll appear in the next couple of hours. But we have to do everything we can to stop public funds from going to these Islamist organizations in the United States, because that legitimizes, and that's why Sam Westrop's work is so important. And also, we need to educate local leaders. And one of the things that I think we're going to have to accept, for at least for the short term, is that we cannot count on the secular leftists to confront this issue on a cultural or even theological level. Okay, and this is one of the other points that has been popping around in my head. Is that ultimately the people who are involved in interfaith dialogue from the Protestant side, the mainline Protestant side, a lot of them are feminist women and men who basically kind of want to be the good guy feminist, okay? Well, every one of the mosques that I've been into in Boston, in England, and in Dearborn was dominated by people that I would call alpha males, or people who wanted to be alpha males, or people who insisted on being led by alpha males. Okay? Right. And they're pretty tough characters. And I want to they can be affable and friendly, but they're broad-shouldered, they look tough, and they want you to know that they're fearless. And on the Protestant Christian side and of the interfaith dialogue, what you have people who just kind of want to be nice. And if that's the way the dialogue is going to go, we're going to have continued problems. And that's one of the reasons why I think evangelical Protestantism, and I speak as a Roman Catholic, I want you to understand that. I think one of the reasons why evangelical Protestantism is more equipped to stand up to that is because that nice guy, aesthetic hasn't overwhelmed the community. There are some alpha males still left in American evangelicalism that are willing to stand up for what they believe. And they, for the short term, may be the only folks who are equipped to stand up to this problem. So, and that's one of the most troubling lessons that I came away with this from.
All right, many thanks. We're approaching the end of our podcast here, and I understand as you've expressed, you're not very optimistic about what's going to happen in Dearborn. But to kind of close, what role should civil society, so churches, schools, local media, play in resisting sectarianism and Islamism and maintaining pluralism in communities like Dearborn?
Okay. One of the things people should do is they should read a book by this individual by the name of Tom Holland called Dominion. And he is, I think, an atheist. He was raised a Christian, but he is very thankful to Christianity because of the legacy, the intellectual legacy that it provides to Western civilization. Okay. If you look at the writings of St. Paul and other people, they say, look, you can understand the universe and understand what is good through the use of your reason. And that's not an idea that is necessarily embraced by a fair number of Islamists, okay? And there's a whole section of theology and jurisprudence that is, I'm going to have to work on. I think, first of all, the Christians need to essentially, instruct their followers about the status of Christians in Muslim-majority environments, in places like Nigeria, Egypt, okay? One of the most outrageous things that has happened is that the Islamist community and its allies on the left have been able to hold up Gaza as if it is the worst thing that's ever happened in the Middle East. When in fact, right now, I've heard numbers, hundreds of thousands of Christians have been murdered in Nigeria by Islamists without any real opposition. We saw that essentially, hundreds of thousands of Christians were driven out of Iraq after the U.S. invasion. And ultimately, nobody really talks about it. Now, I want to make it clear the suffering in Gaza is terrible, and I hope it comes to an end. But I don't want Hamas in power. I don't know how to resolve that. But I think one of the things that we need to remember is that we can't let Gaza be the lens through which we view the Middle East, because that is completely and elementally dishonest. And then one last point, and then I'll be quiet because I don't want to go on too long, is that this ideology of settler colonialism is a profoundly destructive ideology. And I saw this on display at the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee session. Essentially, they use this ideology to essentially justify hostility towards the United States, towards Israel, and towards the West, without coming to grips with the fact that Islamism is itself a settler colonial ideology. Okay, and Arab imperialism and Islamic imperialism is a huge problem, and I think this is really one of the things that the Christian churches are going to have to really push back against, because their faith tradition is being portrayed as the worst source of violence in the world, and without people giving it any credit for its role in setting the tone for Western civilization. And yes, indeed, baptized Christians were responsible for the Holocaust. And we did, and in the doctrine of discovery, legitimized violence against indigenous people. But we are not unique on those things. The Holocaust is pretty unique, but the issue is, despite all of our sins, we have a vibrant and productive civilization that's worthy of protection. And the people and the ideas that people would have to replace it do not support the projects of human survival and human flourishing as well as Western civilization does. And my demands are simple: human survival and human flourishing. And this may sound crazy, but if you want humanity to become a multi-planet species, Western civilization is it. Because I think that we're going to set the tone for what life is going to be like when we get off this planet, and I'd rather have us do it than anyone else. Newt Gingrich said that. but that's long down the road. But we have every right and every obligation to protect our civilization, and we need to counter the leftists who are working as the arm for the Islamists to do it.
Amen to that. And with that, we have reached the end of our podcast for this week. I want to thank you again, Dexter, for stepping in, especially on such short notice. And we look forward to reading more of your work about what you observed.
All right, thank you so much.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, again, this week we will not have a Israel Insider podcast on Wednesday, so I will see you next week for our podcast series, and I hope you all have a great week. Thanks.